We didn't play it a lot, and I think it's probably had a bit to do with the bagpipe thing. In time, in fullness of time, it's become iconic and very much associated with the band. Oddly enough, the band doesn't play it.
AC/DC has delivered decades of explosive performances, belting out hit after hit to packed arenas. But one song has remained in complete silence for over 40 years. Not a single live show, not even a one-off. And it's not because fans didn't love it. Some consider it one of the band's most powerful deep cuts from the Bon Scott era. So what exactly made AC/DC quietly bury this track, despite its haunting brilliance? Keep watching. What we uncovered about its disappearance might just surprise you. The grit and grind behind AC/DC's earliest sound. If you're not deep into AC/DC's story, you'd probably assume Bon Scott was always the voice roaring behind their thunder. But the truth is, the band's beginnings weren't forged in certainty. Before Bon stepped into the frame, the mic belonged to Dave Evans, a frontman with a sharp look, a glam rock flair, and a style that didn't quite match the raw edge the band was chasing. Evans could sing, sure, but the attitude, the grit, the authenticity, that was missing. And that's what Angus and Malcolm Young were hungry for. The Young brothers had already shaped something sharp and primal by 1973. In a time when Australian rock was still an untamed animal, their guitars roared like engines, loud, stripped down, and unforgiving. But they needed a frontman who didn't just sing the songs, but lived them. Enter Ronald Belford Scott. Better known simply as Bon Bon, wasn't new to the music scene. By the time he crossed paths with AC/DC, he'd already piled up a stack of wild experiences and bar stories longer than some bands' careers. He'd delivered mail, poured beers, and driven trucks. His life read like the lyrics of the songs he'd go on to scream. That realness, the kind you can't fake, was what instantly made him part of the machine. He wasn't polished. He was dangerous, and he was perfect. Once the lineup locked in, Bon on vocals, Mark Evans holding the bass, Phil Rudd hammering the drums, and the Young brothers ripping through chords, it didn't take long for the pieces to ignite. But the moment everything snapped together in full color was with their second album, TNT, released in 1975. Compared to their first record, High Voltage, which had raw energy but no clear form, TNT hit like a sharpened blade. The sound was focused, lean, and explosive. Mark Evans would later reflect that it was on this album they truly honed what would become the AC/DC sound. There was nothing elaborate about it, just crushing rhythm, screaming twin guitars, and vocals that didn't ask permission. It was music that punched, and it resonated not because it was perfect, but because it was true. The opening track, It's a Long Way to the Top, If You Want to Rock and Roll, became more than a song. It was a manifesto. With Bon delivering every line like a dare, the lyrics tore into the fantasy of rock stardom. This wasn't about limos and luxury. This was about empty venues, sketchy deals, being underpaid and overlooked, driving hours for a gig that barely covered gas. Bon wasn't exaggerating. He was speaking from the trenches. And that honesty, that bite of lived experience, made the track immortal. And then came the twist: bagpipes. In the middle of this pounding anthem, Angus's guitar collided with Bon's sudden blast of Highland tradition. And somehow, it worked. It was jarring, rebellious, and unforgettable. A traditional instrument set against thundering rock guitars. It was everything AC/DC was about, breaking rules without even pretending to care. TNT cracked the Australian charts and became a foundation the band would keep building on through the rest of the decade. But at its core, the album wasn't about commercial success. It was about locking into a sound that was brutally honest and completely their own. And if it wasn't just the sound that made AC/DC legendary, then what exactly did Bon Scott bring that no one else ever could? Let's dive in. The voice that turned AC/DC into legends. When Bon joined the band in 1974, it wasn't some polished corporate decision. It was a gut feeling, a spark. The young brothers didn't just hear his voice, they felt it. Angus, forever strapped into that schoolboy uniform, once described Bon not as a musician, but as a presence. He wasn't the clean-cut frontman they were supposed to have. He was scrappy, unpredictable, and worn in all the right ways. With a checkered past, a sharp tongue, and a glint in his eye, Bon arrived not to fit in, but to ignite something the band hadn't even realized was missing. This wasn't a man singing songs. This was a man living them. Every line he belted came soaked in real experience. Whether he was poking fun at the chaos of life on the road or painting scenes of back-alley mischief and late-night bravado, it was always grounded in truth. No fantasy, no fluff. Bon's lyrics captured what life looked like from behind the bar, from the back of the van, from the other side of a bad decision. They weren't polished stories. They were postcards from the trenches of rock and roll. Malcolm Young, the silent storm behind the rhythm, once said that Bon gave their band a face. One with a smirk, a scar, and 1,000 stories behind the eyes. Before Bon, AC/DC had a sound. After him, they had a soul. Suddenly, the music had context. It wasn't just music for rebels. It was music by one. He could sing about love, and it would sound like a dare. He could sing about a fight and make it funny. A spilled drink, a broken heart, a busted amp. It all became fair game in Bon's world, and it all rang true. Their live shows became something else entirely. On stage, Angus was lightning, jumping, spinning, and shredding solos like his guitar might explode if he held still too long. But Bon was the gravity, the steady grin, the voice that reached out into the crowd and pulled people in. He didn't perform above the audience, he leveled with them. He was the guy in the crowd, now holding the mic. He spoke their language, shared their vices, and let them laugh through the noise. It wasn't charisma in the traditional sense. It was raw magnetism. Whether he was cracking jokes between songs or leaning into the microphone with that trademark rasp, he made it feel personal. This wasn't just a show. This was a night out with Bon and the boys. And no matter how big the crowd got, he made it feel like they were all packed into some smoky bar down the street. By 1975, AC/DC weren't just rising stars. They were road warriors. They'd played everywhere. Town halls with leaking ceilings, pubs where the crowd was 2 pints away from a brawl, stages too small to hold the full kit. They'd driven endless miles in rickety vans, slept in bug-bitten motels, and lugged their gear through every kind of weather. But they didn't complain. They turned the grind into fuel. Out of that grind came more than sore backs and empty wallets. It birthed songs etched with the bruises of the road. Songs that hit hard, that carried humor, heartbreak, and grit in every bar. And Bon, with that scruffy notebook of alleyway scribbles, didn't let a single lyric slip away. They weren't just another band tearing through smoky clubs across Australia. They were becoming something tighter, meaner, louder. Bon didn't just join the storm, he gave it shape. He locked Angus's wild solos to Malcolm's unshakable rhythm, the scream to the steel, the swagger to the stomp. He wasn't playing the part of a rock star. He was the part. living it, rough, loving it loud, and pouring it all into the mic like he had nothing to lose. Every show felt like a dare, every lyric like a shot of truth straight from the gut. And somewhere along that battered, beer-soaked highway, they found the sound. A song that didn't just echo their rise, it was their rise. All the chaos, all the laughs, all the losses, poured into one perfect, defiant roar. You think you know AC/DC? Then keep watching, because this is where their legend really begins. The song AC/DC Buried. The sound that followed wasn't crafted in some polished studio boardroom. It erupted from the guts of a jam session, raw and unfiltered, just like the band itself. Bon Scott's raspy voice, defiant and sly, didn't just narrate their grind, it lived it. Those lines, getting robbed, getting stoned, getting beat up, broken-boned, weren't embellishments. They were reality, punched into melody. But it was never about wallowing. With Bon, it became a rebel's chant, a smirk in the face of chaos, a grin that dared the world to look away. Then came the moment that changed everything, a stroke of brilliance that no one saw coming. It started as a half-joke, or so they thought, when Bon casually mentioned he might add bagpipes. Angus Young blinked. Bagpipes? In a hard rock track? Most would have laughed and moved on. But Bon wasn't most people. He'd once marched in a pipe band, and now, years later, he dragged a dusty set into the studio, heaving and puffing like a man wrestling a dragon. The pipes shrieked, not gracefully, but with enough grit to cut through steel. And it worked. That sound transformed the track into something unclassifiable. It wasn't rock anymore. It was a full-blown march, a working-class anthem wrapped in distortion and drone. George Young, their producer and older brother to Angus and Malcolm, knew instinctively that Bon's madness had struck genius. One moment, Bon was humming along to a riff. The next, he was standing in front of a mic with a bagpipe clenched in his arms, reshaping what a rock song could be. It didn't just sound different, it felt like rebellion with a drum beat. What came next was straight from a street poet's dream. They didn't drop a big-budget video with slick editing. They hit the pavement, literally. On the 23rd of February 1976, they mounted a flatbed truck, rolled down Swanston Street in Melbourne, and played to the startled cheers of everyday people. Bon, in a battered blue singlet, grinned through the clatter, flanked by the Rats of Tobruk Pipe Band. It wasn't just performance, it was AC/DC Unchained, storming the streets like outlaws with amps. No fancy sets, no pretense, just sound, sweat, and sheer nerve. In that moment, the band became myth. And when they hit the stage live, everything exploded. That song, once born from a basement riff, now lit arenas on fire. It wasn't the guitars or the drums that signaled its arrival. It was the whine of those pipes, unexpected, unapologetic, that drew the crowd into frenzy. When Bon slung them over his shoulder, it was a warning. This wasn't a concert. This was a takeover. By the close of the 70s, the long haul was finally paying off. Highway to Hell, released in 1979, didn't just sell, it detonated. The grit was still there, but polished just enough to slide onto international charts. AC/DC was no longer just Australia's best-kept secret. They'd cracked Europe. America was next. They weren't chasing fame, they were swallowing it whole. But right as the summit came into view, the sky turned black. February 19, 1980. The news hit like a sucker punch. Bon Scott was gone. just 33, found in a parked car on a London street, silenced by the very excess he once mocked in song. Acute alcohol poisoning, the reports read. The man who once outroared the chaos had finally been consumed by it. And was it really the end of an era, or just the beginning of a legend haunted by silence? Let's find out together. What Bon Scott left behind that night. A few days before everything unraveled, Bon Scott wasn't scribbling lyrics or leading a rowdy chorus. Instead, he sat behind the drums, jamming with Angus and Malcolm Young. The early skeletons of Have a Drink on Me and Let Me Put My Love Into You were beginning to take shape, tracks that would later define Back in Black. Some say Bon even left his imprint on Hell's Bells and the title track, not with his voice, but behind the kit. Meanwhile, across town at Scorpio Sound Studio, he'd teamed up with French rockers Trust, reworking lyrics into English. The night ended in a raw, spontaneous version of Ride On, his last ever recording. Then came February 18th, 1980. Bon had spent the night out in Camden at the Music Machine. By morning, he was found unconscious in a small Renault 5 parked in East Dulwich. He never made it past the doors of King's College Hospital. The coroner ruled it death by misadventure, a poetic understatement for such a brutal goodbye. His ashes now rest quietly in Fremantle, but the question of whether the band would carry on didn't linger long. Bon had once raved about Brian Johnson, calling him a true rock and roller. When AC/DC decided to press forward, it wasn't just survival, it was loyalty. Unspoken, but deafening. But just when the sound of roaring crowds seemed to fade into a hollow echo, the silence left behind proved louder than anything they had ever played. The weight of silence. Even as Bon's ashes were taken back to Fremantle, the band found themselves surrounded by a quiet that felt heavier than any thunderous chord they'd ever played. The studio lights were off. The amps are unplugged. Their world, once loud and alive, had gone eerily still. But that silence was never going to last. Not with Malcolm around. The turning point wasn't some grand decision in a boardroom. It came in the form of worn-out strings and half-hearted rehearsals. No plan, no singer, just muscle memory guiding their fingers across fretboards as if chasing ghosts. It was Malcolm who nudged the others toward their instruments again, not with promises or pep talks, but with a practical shrug that said, "We either drown or we play." In the background, Bon's parents made one thing clear. They didn't want statues or tribute tours. They wanted motion, momentum. They didn't want his name buried with him. He wasn't the kind to rest easy, but finding someone new? That was the hardest part. Not because of what the critics might say, but because it meant crossing a line, leaving something sacred behind. They weren't looking for an impersonator. They needed someone who could step up to the mic and make the music louder than the loss. No scripts, no safety nets, just exposed nerves and the fragile hope that Bon would have given his blessing. So they played, not to move on, not to forget, but because silence felt like betrayal. And just as the grief began to settle into the walls of the rehearsal room, something stirred at the edges. A new voice, a new fire, different but defiant, knocking softly at first, then louder. Something was coming, something Bon might have raised a glass to. Don't go anywhere, because the story of what came next will shock you. A voice found in the fire. After Bon was gone, the thought of continuing seemed almost unthinkable. The heart of the band had stopped beating, and what was left was a void. not just of sound, but of soul. Yet even in the quiet, something stirred, the kind of defiance that had always driven them forward. It wasn't bravado, and it wasn't strategy. It was instinct. AC/DC had been born out of grit, and that same spirit whispered now that Bon wouldn't have wanted the silence to last. Still, the idea of a new frontman felt like walking a tightrope across sacred ground. They weren't just searching for a singer, they were searching for someone who could step into the fire without pretending to be the flame. The audition tapes poured in, some promising, most forgettable. Nothing felt right. Until, one day, a fan's letter from Chicago mentioned a name: Brian Johnson. That name sparked something. Years earlier, Bon had seen Johnson perform with a band called Geordie. The memory had stuck with him, not just because of the energy, but because of the sheer madness of it. Johnson had collapsed mid-set, screaming on the floor. Bon thought it was the best stage act he'd ever seen. He hadn't known at the time that Brian had been suffering from appendicitis. But that mix of pain, fire, and spectacle left an impression. Meanwhile, in Newcastle, Brian Johnson was fixing cars and playing club gigs in between, trying to restart his old band. He hadn't expected much else, so when a call came out of nowhere asking him to come down to London for an audition, with no details and a cryptic AC wants to DC, he almost said no. The voice on the phone wouldn't reveal the band's name, only the initials. He laughed it off at first. "You mean Assad?" he'd joked. Still, curiosity won. He boarded a train. What he found in that rehearsal room wasn't a rock and roll circus. It was something quieter. He later described it as walking into a wake. The band, dressed in plain clothes, spoke softly, still clearly wrapped in grief. But they played. First, a rhythm and blues standard, something familiar to ease into the moment. Then, Nutbush City Limits. Then, Whole Lotta Rosie. That's when it clicked. Brian's voice wasn't Bon's. It was raspier, grittier, forged in smoky pubs and working men's clubs. But it fit. Not by imitation, but by attitude. It was loud and unapologetic, and wild in its own way. Malcolm and Angus felt it immediately. This wasn't someone trying to be Bon Scott. This was someone who, like Bon, lived and breathed the raw honesty of rock. Afterwards, there were no big speeches, no dramatic reveals, just a simple question. "Do you want the job?" Brian didn't hesitate. "Are you kidding?" "Of course I do." But he was clear from the start. He wasn't trying to fill Bon's boots. "Nobody can. I'm just going to be myself." That honesty, more than any high note or stage move, was what sealed it. Brian hadn't come to replace Bon. He came to help carry the fire forward. The one song he would never touch. And so, when discussions turned to the live set list, one song instantly stirred the room into silence. It was more than music. It was memory, legacy, and emotion bundled into one anthem. Without raising his voice or making a dramatic declaration, Brian Johnson made his stance clear. "It's a long way to the top" was off limits. He didn't say it with arrogance or entitlement. In fact, he said it with something far rarer in rock history: humility. "I'm not doing that one. I can't," he told them quietly. That's Bon's song. It wasn't about vocal strain or musical preference. It was about reverence. For Brian, that particular song wasn't just part of the catalog. It was Bon Scott's personal signature, a time capsule of who he was when the world first truly listened. There was no room for negotiation. No one in the band pushed back, because they all felt it too. Angus Young, especially, recognized that what Brian was doing wasn't just about respecting the past, it was about protecting something sacred. The song, with its unforgettable bagpipe solo and raw vocal energy, belonged to Bon in a way no other track ever could. Even imagining someone else recreating that magic felt like breaking an unspoken rule. And so, It's a Long Way to the Top, If You Wanna Rock and Roll, was quietly retired from their live performances, not with fanfare, but with silent mutual understanding. Not because it wasn't loved, but because it was too loved. That kind of affection doesn't fade. It gets fossilized in history, never to be replicated. The decision may have seemed small on the surface, just one song left off a set list. But within it lay something massive. Brian Johnson wasn't trying to replace Bon Scott. He was trying to carry the band forward while keeping its spirit intact. That balance between respect and renewal defined not only Brian's approach, but the band's survival. Even as Back in Black, their first album without Bon, catapulted them into legendary status, selling over 50 million copies and becoming one of the most successful albums ever recorded, there was no temptation to slip the track back in. Success didn't blur the line. If anything, it made the boundary sharper. For over 4 decades, fans kept waiting, hoping, whispering at shows. Would they ever bring it back? Just once? A tribute performance, perhaps? But Brian never budged. Not once. Even as the band's sound evolved and the crowds grew louder, that one track remained locked away. Industry insiders called it restraint, a quiet kind of power. It wasn't just respect, it was resolve. Proof that legacy isn't about repetition. That sometimes the boldest move is silence. A refusal not out of fear, but out of meaning. That's how It's a Long Way to the Top stopped being a song and became a sacred boundary. Its absence wasn't a hole in the set list. It was a message, a preserved truth, a quiet salute to what came before. But there was another reason it stayed buried, and it had nothing to do with reverence. It had everything to do with what the song demanded, and what it took from those who played it. Keep watching. The second reason, they never looked back. Performing the song live was a logistical nightmare. At the heart of the chaos, the bagpipes. That iconic screeching wail that defined the track was never meant to be a staple of a rock show. Bagpipes, by nature, are demanding and temperamental. Mark Evans once mentioned they didn't even play them live most of the time. Instead, they resorted to using a cassette recording. Before stepping out onto stage, the band would huddle behind the curtain, guitars tuned to match the bagpipes' pitch. Timing had to be razor-sharp, because if they were off by a second, the whole intro fell apart. It wasn't just about sound, it was about syncing chaos with precision. Every night felt like diffusing a bomb. Eventually, the tape itself became part of the problem. According to some stories, Evans grew so frustrated with the setup that he destroyed the cassette one night, unaware it was the only copy of the master. With no backup, the song vanished from the set list overnight. Other rumors claim fans once yanked the actual bagpipes off stage, mid-performance. Yes, the very ones Bon Scott played in the music video, only to destroy them in the pit. If that sounds like rock and roll, it also sounds like a roadie's worst nightmare. They tried workarounds. Bon, at one point, had a mic fitted directly into his bagpipes, trying to perform it live. But after one breathy blast, he'd be too winded to sing. Some say they even used keyboards or synths in later attempts, but it always felt like a cheap imitation. And with Scott gone, that balance was never quite the same. There's also a side of the story no one says out loud. The spotlight of the song wasn't where AC/DC typically placed it. Bon's vocals, Malcolm's steady rhythm, and that marching band stomp from the drums took center stage. Angus Young, the band's live wire, was unusually restrained. No blistering solo, no signature riffs that sent him duck-walking across the stage. Just a few tasteful licks in the background. The song might have thrilled fans, but for Angus, it may have been a chore, stripped of the theatrical energy he thrived on. And then there's Brian Johnson. After Bon's passing, the torch had to be carried, but replicating that mix of cheeky grit and breath control on Long Way was a big ask. Maybe Brian didn't want to imitate Bon, or maybe he knew he couldn't. Even now, with session musicians and tech that could mimic the bagpipe intro with ease, the band still refuses to touch it. So perhaps the song disappeared for more practical reasons than poetic ones. Not every tribute ages well under the spotlight. Sometimes it's not about reverence or legacy. Sometimes it's about the sheer wear and tear of trying to keep the wheels from falling off. The album that roared through grief. That new sound didn't replace what came before. It rose from it, forged in fire and loss. After Bon Scott's passing, many believed AC/DC might crumble. Their lightning finally dimmed. But the band, always stubborn, always loud, chose to answer heartbreak, not with silence, but with something thunderous. Their next move wasn't retreat. It was resurrection. Instead of chasing the ghost of their former frontman, they lit a path forward, fueled by memory and momentum. They left behind the gray skies of grief and flew to Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas, where palm trees swayed and heavy hearts tried to heal. There, Brian Johnson, a Geordie singer with a rasp like gravel on fire, was tasked with a nearly impossible job: to write lyrics that would live up to the razor-edged poetry of Bon. The pressure was immense, but Johnson didn't shrink from it. He funneled the weight of expectation and sorrow into words that cut through the noise like cannon fire. The result was Back in Black, released just 5 months after Bon's death, in July 1980. Its all-black cover needed no explanation. It was both elegy and explosion. From the opening toll of Hell's Bells, it was clear this wasn't just an album. It was a monument. Each track slammed with the raw energy AC/DC was known for. But now, there was an undertone of reverence threaded through the riffs. Johnson didn't mimic Bon. He stood beside him, crafting lyrics that mirrored the swagger but reflected a deeper ache. The gamble paid off. Back in Black didn't just succeed, it roared. It became one of the best-selling albums in history, lifting the band into a new realm of fame. But more than the numbers, it proved something sacred: that AC/DC could honor the past without being chained to it. That Bon's spirit could echo not just in memory, but in every scream of every chorus. In concert halls across the globe, that spirit came alive again. Songs like TNT, Whole Lotta Rosie, and Highway to Hell weren't buried with Bon. They exploded from stage speakers night after night. And Johnson, far from impersonating, gave them new blood. He brought his own growl, his own rhythm, while preserving the bones Bon had built. Fans didn't see it as a replacement. They saw it as a resurrection. Even Angus Young felt the ghost beside them. When Brian sings those songs, the crowd feels it. Bon's there. He's part of every show, he once said. Brian's not trying to be Bon. That's what makes it real. And yet, one song always remained untouched. It's a Long Way to the Top never made it into the post-Bon set list. Its silence was louder than any amp. It wasn't forgotten. It was sacred, left untouched as a quiet, private shrine. It belonged to Bon and the road they first traveled together. A summit reached, but never repeated. So, what do you think truly kept AC/DC alive after Bon's death? Was it raw talent, sheer will, or something more haunting? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe.